Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Philip Gorski, a professor of sociology. He is a comparative historical sociologist with strong interest in theory and methods and in modern and early modern Europe. His empirical work focuses on topics such as state formation, nationalism, revolution, economic development, and secularization, with particular attention to the interaction of religion and politics. Other current interests include the philosophy and methodology of the social sciences and the nature and role of rationality in social life. Today we'll talk with Professor Gorski about his new book, American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present. Welcome, Professor Gorski.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. It's good to be back.
Okay, let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
The book is an attempt to recover an older tradition within American political culture, one that I think at the moment is sorely needed because it is a middle way between the two fronts in the ongoing culture war.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what led you to write the book?
The civil religion idea was introduced into American social science by my doctoral thesis advisor, the late Robert Bellah. Mm-hmm. And I had read his work as a graduate student, obviously, but hadn't really thought much about it, or for that matter, that much about American politics, since, as you mentioned in the introduction, I really was trained as a Europeanist. But I got interested in it during the 2008 election campaign because I heard echoes of what Bellah had described as the civil religious tradition in Barack Obama's political campaign. Mm-hmm. And initially set out just to write a kind of a deeper history of Obama's political outlook. Mm-hmm. And as time went on, he kind of faded from being the leading character to just a supporting actor in a larger story in which I tried to trace out an ongoing conversation about the American project that's mm-hmm. been going on since the foundation mm-hmm. of Puritan New England and continues to the present day and hopefully beyond the present day as well.
Okay. When you use the term civil religion, what do you mean by that?
Different people define civil religion in different ways. But the way I would put it is that it is the way in which a particular people thinks about its political project in a larger, or in some sense, transcendent frame. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be transcendent in the religious sense. It simply has to be transcendent in the sense that it translates the immediate here and now and our particular values and interests, mm-hmm. right? So relating our polity, our political project to something larger. In the case of the American civil religion, it draws on two different traditions, or so I argue in the book, that I call prophetic religion and civic republicanism. And what I mean by prophetic religion is the social justice ethic of the Hebrew prophets. Mm-hmm. The idea that the nation is a nation that's under judgment in some sense, not chosen for its virtues, but placed under judgment. And the idea of civic republic is the idea that the polity is something that's devoted to the commonwealth or the common good. That's the literal translation of mm-hmm. the res publica, for the Roman term from which we derive the idea of the republic. So in this sense, it's about more than just our own personal self-interest or our own private dreams, mm-hmm. but it's something that transcends those in some sense. And that's what I mean by civil religion.
Okay. In the preface of your book, you write, some common interpretations of our shared past are badly in need of correction. What do you mean by that?
So I contrast civil religion with two other ways of thinking about American democracy. One I refer to as religious nationalism. Mm-hmm. And that is the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation And the implication of that is, of course, that somebody who's not a Christian cannot be a full member of the nation. I think that's mistaken. So people who claim that the American founders were Orthodox Christians in the sense in which some contemporary Christians would define that sense, I think is deeply mistaken. But I also contrast it with what I call radical secularism, which is the idea that the American project was based on Enlightenment values. That is also, I think, mistaken. It's mistaken in the sense that the political tradition that was most important for the American founders was not the Enlightenment tradition of the 18th century, but rather this ancient tradition of civic republicanism, which goes back through England, Italy, all the way to ancient Rome and Greece. And this was a tradition that the American founders were deeply familiar with. They all read Latin and Greek. They all had read Cicero, for example, who's a central thinker here. And so I think both of these interpretations are fundamentally mistaken, and that the way that we have to understand the founding values of the United States as a kind of a mix or a hybrid between religious and secular traditions.
Okay, in fact, you do argue that we should take the middle of the road. Do you want to elaborate on that and why we should do so?
Well, I argue that the culture wars that have been going on in this country, basically for all of my adult life, are in part driven by a dispute over the proper place of religion in public life. And that debate has been dominated by religious nationalists and radical secularists. Radical secularists arguing that the Constitution mandates a total separation of religion and politics, which it doesn't. The phrase total separation appears nowhere in the Constitution.
Oh, really?
And
that's interesting.
yeah, appears nowhere in the Constitution. The Constitution, in fact, argues for the there shall be no established church, but there shall also be free exercise of religion. And they thereby created a kind of a fundamental tension that's left for us to work out together collectively. I think one can argue that it mandates separation of church and state, but that's not the same thing as separation of religion and politics. Separation of religion and politics, that means that people cannot speak in a religious voice in public affairs, even if that is the voice that is the one that comes most naturally to them, the one that allows them to articulate their most deeply held values. But I think I'm equally opposed to this idea of the United States as founded on religious nationalism. I mean, one of the most fundamental values in the Constitution is the free exercise of religion, and that also implies the freedom to exercise no religion, to choose no religion. So central to our understanding of the American project is religious freedom and cultural pluralism, and it's simply something that we have to accept and come to terms with, and not try to shout down people who come from a different perspective than we do.
Right. In terms of your interest in the intersection, I'll call it, between religion and politics, we're just coming out of the election where Donald Trump is now the president-elect, and many white evangelicals did come out in support of him. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think there's a couple of things that need to be said. The first thing that needs to be said is that some white evangelicals in particular voted for Trump for pragmatic political reasons. They've become singularly focused on what I call the pelvic issues, abortion and gay marriage, and have been angling for decades to get a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and saw that this was possibly in sight, and that if they lost this election, they would certainly lose that conservative majority on the Supreme Court for a generation. So that was certainly prominent in the minds of many Christian evangelicals, who may therefore have viewed Trump as the lesser of two evils. The other thing that needs to be said is that there were quite a few very thoughtful and well-known Christian evangelical intellectuals who came out very forcefully, very early against Trump. And I will simply point to two of them: Russell Moore, who's an official for the Southern Baptist Convention, and Peter Wehner, who wrote a number of very impassioned anti-Trump editorials in the New York Times that some of the listeners may have seen. But this still leaves us with a puzzle. The fact is that many American evangelicals expressed support for Trump even before he was the only man standing. That is, when people like Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz, who have very good evangelical bona fides, were still very much in the race. And that is a puzzle that I think I can shed some light on. In the sense that the kind of American exceptionalism, the kind of religious nationalism that some Christian evangelicals, not all, but some embrace, has some strange resonances with Donald Trump's worldview. I'll just point to a couple here. One is apocalypticism, that is the idea that the world is going to end imminently, and that the end of the world is presaged by different kinds of natural disasters, by moral decline. Of course, there's nobody who used the word disaster more often during the campaign than Donald Trump. Everything was a disaster. And so this kind of very pessimistic worldview, I think, resonated, was an area of resonance. Another, I think, somewhat more chilling one was rhetoric about sacrifice, in particular the need to make blood sacrifice to the nation. This is a very old idea within religious nationalism. This is where present-day talk about the soldier's death in battle as the ultimate sacrifice comes from. This goes back not just to the Civil War, but actually all the way back to the Puritan era. And Trump, particularly during the primary campaigns, played on this with a rather chilling story. He spoke, it's an apocryphal story about General John Pershing, who during the conquest and occupation of the Philippines during World War II was reputed to have captured 50 Islamic terrorists, which is Philippine rebels, and then to have had 50 bullets dipped in pig's blood, and then to have used 49 of those bullets to execute 49 of the prisoners, and then to have given the 50th bullet to the lone survivor and sent him back to tell his people that they should not engage in terrorism. And the applause line is that there was no more Islamic terrorism in the Philippines for 30 years. So this idea that there's a sort of a magical quality to this blood sacrifice, and that blood has to be spilled to resolve our issues and maintain our status. So this is another area of resonance. The last one is just that Trump often presented himself in quasi-messianic terms. I alone can fix it.
Right.
I alone can fix it. How will he fix it? Not clear. You simply have to trust in him and his powers. And there was a lot of debate about this in evangelical social media. Some people said, well, maybe he's like King David. King David was also an adulterer, let's not forget. But I think that was a little bit too much for a lot of people, and they actually compared him to Cyrus the Great, who was the Persian emperor who delivered the Jews from the Babylonian captivity in the Bible. And so this idea of a kind of a secular instrument of divine protection who would sort of cast down the enemies of evangelicalism. This was a very widespread interpretation and kind of theological justification of the Trump presidency. And so there are lots of ways I think they're not obvious to an outsider, in which Trump's rhetoric really resonated for some conservative evangelicals, despite this sort of obvious dissonance between his own personal conduct and evangelical talk about family values.
Right. It is interesting to me because I don't think Trump really, is not thinking religion when he's saying the things that he says, but yet people are perceiving his comments in that regard.
So I think what has happened here is that a lot of American popular culture has taken some of these themes on board. So think about the idea of the apocalypse, right? This is the post-apocalypse is a genre now of movies, of comic books, of novels. Conversely, some people may be familiar with the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and a co-author, which has also been turned into films. And this is basically a transformation of a particular evangelical understanding of the end times into, kind of a Tom Clancy style thriller novel.
Even, I think, climate change feeds into that
Absolutely.
apocalyptical kind of ending.
Absolutely.
Okay, and getting back to the book, the history of civil religion from the Puritans to today, has there been a big change in civil religion through those years, or has it been pretty much predominantly the same? I mean, some of the things that you were speaking about for Trump, you can look back to the Puritans and find some of those very same things. So is it true that it's pretty much gone unchanged, or has there been a lot of different changes that it's gone through?
So it has grown and transformed over the course of American history, and I'll just give two examples of this. So, I already mentioned that one of the central values that's enshrined in the Constitution is the idea of religious freedom, right? But there were a lot of qualifications and provisos on what that would mean. This was probably most obvious in kind of anti-Catholic sentiment during the 19th century up into the early 20th century. I think many people today probably don't realize what an enormous thing it was when John F. Kennedy, a practicing Catholic, became the President of the United States. That was something which would have really been impossible even in the early 20th century, when a Catholic, Al Smith, ran for the presidency and was soundly defeated after a kind of a rabid anti-Catholic campaign. So part of it is understanding, a broader understanding of religious freedom as something that doesn't just apply to Protestants or to Christians. The other thing I would really point to as an example of how it's grown and evolved is our understanding of equality. We all know the famous words and the preamble to the Declaration about all men created equal. And we also know that the Constitution violated or broke with that promise by declaring, tacitly at least, that an African slave was only 3/5 of a person. And it took a civil war and a civil rights movement for people to fully understand that equality had to mean racial equality, and not just the equality of white property-holding men. And obviously, you have to put the suffragettes into that story there as well, and the feminist movement of the 1960s. Even if we sort of agree on what our values are, I think that we sometimes blind ourselves to what they actually imply or mean for how we should order our lives together.
So ultimately, what would you like the reader of your book to take away? What lesson?
I guess at the moment, I think of a special importance are two ideas. One is the idea of civility, which comes out of civil religion. And civility means, at a minimum, that we engage with one another with a certain degree of trust and openness and mutual respect. And these are all things which I don't need to tell anybody here are sorely lacking after this latest electoral campaign, which has not only sown and deepen divisions of race and of party, but divisions that are even now cutting through and dividing families. You hear stories of people unfriending one another on Facebook. I read this morning a story about people disinviting relatives for Thanksgiving because of divisions over this election. And here I do really lay a lot of the blame at the feet of Donald Trump for violating the most obvious norms of civic discourse and even human decency. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the notion of, that's important to the book is the notion of a vital center. And what I mean by a vital center is not some kind of political consensus where we all agree about what equality and freedom mean and how you balance those two things with one another. But what I mean by that is a basic commitment to those things as values that make us a people, and without which we'll no longer be a people, without which there will no longer be American democracy in any meaningful sense. I mean, without that sort of basic level of agreement, it's not possible for us to have meaningful disagreements. And that is increasingly what you see. Debate just devolves into trading insults, shouting matches, demonization, mutual recrimination. I really, really fear for the future of the American Republic at the present moment.
Right. Well, I think you have your work cut out for you over the next 4 years in evaluating what happens, and I thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much, Marilyn.
For more information about Professor Gorski and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.